is TK Smith, and I am curating the forthcoming exhibition Looming Chaos at the Zuckerman Museum of Art. It is a solo exhibition of the artist Zipporah Camille Thompson's woven works, as she uses the loom to grapple with ideas of chaos. Today I'm joined by Zipporah and LA-based artist Diedrick Brackens to have a meditation on the loom. This is Clark Atlanta's Art Museum, where currently we have 3 shows on view. Right now we're sitting in front of Alfred Conte's The Sweet Spot. At the other end of the gallery there's Sheila Pre-Bright's Radical Lens, and in the middle of the gallery there's Black Interiors, which is a show from our permanent collection. So thank y'all for coming. And the first question I wanted to ask is, how do you both identify as artists?
Absolutely. Great question. As far as how do I identify as an artist, I mean, there's so many ways that I feel like I'm constantly thinking of myself when I'm making things and approaching my work and approaching my practice. I definitely think of myself as, in some ways or another, like a conjurer, someone who brings about or has the power to bring about something and to create something and to make something through the work that I do in the works themselves. And so that's one way I kind of approach my practice, is thinking of this idea of this person who has these abilities to do that, as well as I think of myself as approaching my work and thinking about all of the research and all of the things that are near and dear to my heart, ideas concerning feminism, and thinking of myself as a feminist, and thinking of myself as an activist, and thinking of myself as a person who has to keep their hands moving for their sanity. And so it's all these things, from like the little things to the large things. I don't like to think of it too much as like, I guess, putting labels or definitions on it, but definitely those are some of the ways that I identify as an artist. Yeah, how about you, CJ?
Yeah, I would say that I almost always privilege weaving first. So if someone asks me what I do, I'll tell them I'm a weaver, which gets like complicated, I think, in terms of how people are like not so familiar with that term. So I think people are like, weaver. But to me, it feels important to pull that history forward, because I think about contemporary art being such a huge label, fiber art being another kind of complicated label, but I think weaver is like specific, and it talks about the ways that both those materials come together, but I think thinks about the complexities of like being Black and queer and male and all these other things that sort of overlap and intersect. But weaver.
Okay, so both of you utilize the loom. I was wondering how you were introduced to the loom.
Yeah, so my first introduction to the loom was a while ago. I want to say maybe 2008. And I learned how to weave in like an undergraduate textile class that I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I was going to become a painter, and somehow kind of stumbled into more fibers classes, and I learned how to weave from a Palestinian American artist. Her name is Mary Tuma. She introduced me to weaving first, and that was kind of my first introduction to weaving and the techniques, and like what could just like structurally, the process and the how to warp the loom and just the basics, and then it kind of like took off from there, and
I love that you like say the name of the person who taught you to weave, because I think sometimes there's like a tendency to think like I just like found this thing and then I like mastered it. But I remember Leslie Robertson in 2008 in like a weaving one class, like showed me how to weave. And even kind of a step back, this woman, Mary Becker, who I was taking like a intro to sculpture class with, was just like, oh, you're a textile major, at a point where I'd never heard of such a thing. And she was the one who encouraged me to take this weaving class when I thought I was gonna be a photographer. Like, so I had this other like whole trajectory in my mind. Yeah, but I learned to weave, what is that, 11 years ago now? And I remember like those very like first moments of like that kind of tactile experience of like the material and color and learning all these processes and the kind of like kind of sculptural impulse of just the act of weaving being so much full body and machine and thread, like all kind of moving together. Yeah.
Absolutely. It sounds like we started in learning the process of weaving and being introduced to the loom around the same time, which is really exciting. Yeah, and just to see everything develop and evolve from there has been really exciting.
So as you were going through that discovery process of, I think I'm going to be a painter, let me try this, or I'm going to be a photographer, let me try this, what was it about the loom that spoke to you so much, or what narratives are you allowed or able to say or express through the loom that you can't express through those other mediums?
That's a really great question, and I think I struggled with that early on. I struggled with how to use the loom, not just like, I mean, obviously you can create cloth, but then to push that cloth and like impart meaning and impart like the reasons why you're on the loom creating the cloth in the first place was something that I really had to kind of figure out and make sense of and reckon with. And I think it wasn't clear and it wasn't evident to me at all in the beginning. And but it was when I kind of came back to it and graduate school and some time away from undergraduate studies and not really completely having all the answers, that I think I began to understand what it was about the loom that continuously drew me in and kind of like summoned me in so many ways. And I think it was just the beauty of the process and the beauty of something that was like larger than myself, in that I feel like I have to be present in every way, but at the same time present in none of the ways to be able to create on the loom. Conceptually, I found how it related and ties between why, the actions I was taking and this cloth that I was making. I finally found that kind of like harmony, and so then it made sense, and so then I continued to just develop from there.
Yeah, no, I think for me, like the kind of initial things that drew me to it were, I think all weavers say some version of like the kind of meditative things. Like I remember I was just like, oh, this is like a place where I can like take all this energy and thoughts and like questions and not necessarily get an answer, but have a kind of like a holding space to think about them. Like it feels like a kind of container. And I always compare weaving to like a long road trip or something, because there's that like you kind of tune out and just go with the kind of rhythm of the machine. And another thing which I've never done is time travel. Like to me, there's something about like putting a thread through the dent, through the heddles, and like tying it on the back, that I'm like, oh, these are like motions, no matter what the weaver is making, that like all weavers sort of encounter like throughout time and space. So there's something like so powerful about those like simple gestures and like the kind of labor that goes into it. And as far as narrative, I think it took a long time to kind of figure out the conceptual parts of the like, why am I using this practice and what does it feed into the work that all these other kind of ways of making can't. That now I feel like quite sure of.
Exactly, yeah.
But I feel like that took like at least 8 years before I was like, aha.
It took so long, and it actually took me like not weaving at all. and just stepping completely away to be able to come back to it and be like, okay, what really is happening here? And like really digging in so deeply and so intensively, working towards, my thesis and everything. And that's when I feel like I started to start to formulate the answers. And only now am I similar, only now I'm just, still scratching the surface of like all of the immense like power of weaving, and conceptually, and all of these ways, like my personal relationship with the loom and my work and weaving.
So at what point, the loom is a machine that's created to create cloth or tapestry or rug or carpet. At what point for you does it become art? At what point are you like, you don't cover up with this, or you don't wear this, this is something, this is art?
Yeah, I think the beauty of the question that you're asking is that for me, there isn't really that answer there. When I'm sitting down at the loom, I don't have that answer of at what point does this become this thing? I have no idea. And I think that's why I like it so much and I'm drawn to it so much, is for me, I like those questions unanswered. I have pieces now that did start out as a sculpture or what I thought was going to be a woven kind of installation, and definitely have become a garment piece for a future performance, and it's still hanging exactly where it's been hanging since I pieced it together and pulled it off the loom and finished it, just because I'm waiting for the right time and the rest of the right answers to all of that to kind of culminate and come together. And I've tried to install the cloth, I've tried to, sculpt it around a frame, I've tried to do all these things that I originally began and just knew that, or hoped that it would become this thing that I had this answer for. And still, it boggles my mind how then the work is just like, it's not asking to be that thing that I originally envisioned, and I'm okay with that. And I find that a lot in weaving. There's so many times where I'll weave a fragment of or cloth, and it'll take on its own life and become something else. And I imagined it to become this piece of this other thing, but then it becomes something else entirely. And so I kind of like to not think too much in that way when I do sit down at the loom, and to really just allow room for exploration and room for kind of chaos and room for losing kind of control over what I'm intending for this cloth and intending to happen while on the loom.
I feel like it's complicated for me in that, like, I remember, like, I think my transition to making weavings, like, had already come where I had this click that, like, I was making art. So for me, I think I've like backed into this idea, because I was like, I would make a textile always intending that it was going to be a piece of art. Like I've never made a scarf or like anything like that with the work for quite a while. So I was like, oh, I'm in art school, I make art, this is an extension of that. But once you encounter folks outside of sort of maybe a school or specifically a fiber bubble, I think there are a lot of questions around sort of like, oh, like what's this gonna be? Or like, and which I think is kind of coded language for like, how is this useful?
Sure.
That I never really kind of made a problem for myself as a maker. But now I think I'm returning to this point of thinking kind of about the root of the work, of the practice being so much about utility, that for me it feels like I need to make things that are both useful or functional alongside things that are to be seen or looked at, although I do think that is useful.
Okay. Well, the exhibition is called Looming Chaos, and it plays on your exploration of chaos and destruction, the environment. How do you take a tool that focuses completely on structure and construction and explore chaos?
That's a really great question. So that was some of the struggle and some of that tension, so to speak, of why initially I kind of had to step away from weaving and figure all out those answers. For me, that structure and the way it did demand so much of you, and all of the numbers and all of the all of the threads and all of the attention and the structure and rigidity of working on the loom, and there's this you can't escape mentally. It takes a while to escape this idea of this cloth and just this thing that runs just like vertically from your body, and just seeing it and imagining it and envisioning it only as that. And it's very hard to begin to think kind of past that, or to think kind of past this one singular cloth that you're working on in that moment, and think about all the possibilities off the loom. But I eventually got there to where I began thinking, well, hey, even if you're kind of confined in that way, that doesn't mean that wefts can't get really wild and organic and fluid and sculptural. And wefts, for those of you that might not be familiar, what you're actually weaving or inserting into each shot is that thing itself doesn't have to be also very rigid. That thing can be sculptural, or build volume, or build texture, or build whatever you would like it to build. And so I began to play with that idea, as well as thinking like off the loom. So even if I did still stick with kind of like the really fine threads, or the really kind of like structure of a very traditional warp and a very traditional weft, still even removing it from the loom, there are all these sculptural possibilities of how does it drape, or how does it fold, or how does it then behave when it's stretched around a form, or some sort of armature. And so I really began to push that idea, and in that way, that was my own personal, that was where it clicked for me, and really became something special, that I could see it really taking shape and taking root in my practice and the work, because in that way it related to chaos, which chaos and disorder and destruction and all of those ideas were ideas that I didn't kind of want to lose by kind of going down this other path of working with the loom and weaving. So I was finally seeing how I could do that and merge the two, and explore in that way, and explore chaos through very structured confines of the loom.
I think I think the things that frustrated me early in weaving were the kind of like, were the things that I loved originally, because it's like, oh, like there's one way to do this, like these sort of mathematical equations will equal a thing that's these dimensions, which was very comforting for a while. And then I got to a point where I was like, oh, like this is so limiting. Like I have to like sort of exist within this kind of mesh grid locked tight system. Like I know what it's going to be before it's even been made. And then that was like, oh, like I don't need, like why would I want to make that thing now? That I think for me, it's been this kind of battle of the plan and improvising. And I think there's something about thinking about speed of like changing direction and weaving that don't seem to kind of align. That to me, I'm like, I've gotten to a point where I'm like, oh, I can like dramatically shift this by X or Z in terms of changing the material that's being woven into it, like you were saying, cutting things, trying to add things. And for me, it's like working in strips or doing things where things kind of get pieced together afterwards, give me ways to kind of break that sort of system or pattern that feel really exciting. Yeah.
So in the process of creation, have you found limitations to telling the kind of narratives or concepts you want to convey? Have you found a limitation you keep hitting up against when you're trying to create something or say something specific, and you found that the loom just can't do that?
No.
Yeah, I was going to say, no.
No, it feels very malleable to me now. Like I think there was maybe a point where I was like, ugh, and now I'm like, I feel like this is the most plastic material and process there is. Like I feel like it sort of, it seems so organic to me in a way that it didn't when I started weaving. But I think that's through like handling it for so long, looking at it for so long, thinking about it. I feel like I'm in my head at night, will lay down and I'm like drafting patterns or like thinking about sequences that I haven't tried. But I think it's just like you sit there for so long, you can't help but see how you can sort of like enter this machine. And I think there's a mutual exchange between the loom and myself. Like I think like as much as I'm kind of acting on it, it's acting on me. And you're just like so enmeshed in it, I think, when you're weaving that the kind of distinction between machine and body kind of fall away.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, and that's one of the things that for sure, like I feel like you have to embrace, but also it's good to want to embrace that, you know, and not fight that, which there was some of that in the beginning, like this tension of, you're demanding so much of me and my body, my brain, and all of it, but when you work in conjunction with that and really embrace all of that, that's when I think, you know, it really clicks. As well as, I don't feel limited in any way at the loom. I feel like with as much woven work that I've made, there's still so many more things I want to say and do and create with weaving. And that's what I love about it, is now I'm thinking like, you know, well, maybe I can't make this an image, but maybe this piece, then I can convey this idea that I'm trying to explore through a more sculptural piece. Or maybe there's something that's on the surface that I'm, you know, adding that then can say or add meaning or impart something else in this other way. So I feel like it's just like, you know, with experience, you begin to understand all the different ways you can say all of maybe the things you were trying to say or explore through weaving. And I don't feel that there's anything that I cannot say that I want to say with weaving if I choose to do that.
So what I'm hearing is so much of the work happens also after the work has left the loom. Can you talk about some of your common amendments you make to your work after it's off the loom?
Yeah. So there's not only just the finishing, right? Which is a whole process in and of itself, just keeping the ends from unraveling. Choosing how you want to, like, so there's all of these different types of knotting techniques and finishing techniques. So that's one whole thing. And then if you are putting together panels, or if you're putting together pieces, or if those pieces then are conjoined with other quilted work or other materials, then there's that kind of whole nother level of, you know, thinking about this marriage or this harmony of these two different pieces that you've made. I know for you, with the panels that you create, there's a lot of
sewing.
Piecing and sewing, right?
Yeah, I used to hate sewing. Like I would do everything, like try to make the work in so many ways that I could like not sew anything. That now it's like it's just as valuable and important and pleasurable as the weaving for me. So I'll build mounds of like pieces that need to be sewn so that I can be like, okay, next week I'm just gonna be at the sewing machine, like, or I'm just gonna have my needle out. But to me, it feels like I get to impart more sort of information in the work after the weaving by doing kind of sewing or bringing in objects or laying it on the floor. One of the things that like often people will come to the studio and I will put stuff up on the wall, but when I'm working on it still after the loom, I lay it on the floor because it's sort of that same space of weaving to me, I think, keeping it horizontal. And I'll like walk on them and all this, and people are like, "Oh my God, you're walking on the work." And I'm like, "It's fine. It's like I'm patinaing, you know. It's like I'm adding something to it by continuing to sort of like be in conversation with it physically, I think. Yeah, but I think there's a lot of like, a lot of things happen afterwards, and like all of them aren't physical, I don't think.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think also, just to add to that, a lot of the pieces that I make, so a lot of them are kind of like not of the same material that then get pieced together, or that then kind of are combined together. So a lot of it for me too is also creating a panel or panels of one material or one idea, then those kind of like rest, similar to what you were saying, like they rest somewhere, whether it's on the floor or on the wall with other things, and then others are created out of different materials, a different idea, and then those then are collaged together. So yeah, absolutely. I think, bringing all these things together, there's so many possibilities of what to do once it's ever woven, that's so much time already. And that's what I love about it, is that you really become immersed in creating this cloth itself, and then there's this whole nother level of work to be done afterwards.
So both of you kind of challenge traditional ideas of weaving in these ways, in these interdisciplinary ways. You bring found objects, and you collage, and you assemblage, and all these different things. Can you talk about your use of abstraction in your work? Both of you, in some cases, have used abstraction heavily for you. How does abstraction allow you to tell kind of the narratives you want to tell?
For me, abstraction is a way to explore the unknown, and then maybe explore, especially like when considering experiences, especially particularly of those for African Americans or people of color. There are these narratives or these futures that don't necessarily exist. And for me, abstraction is one way of exploring that. Abstraction is a way to explore the unknown, as I mentioned, and the unknown is a lot in my work, like thinking of the cosmic and this vast infinity, and ideas also coming back to ideas of blackness and being a colored person. Also, I think abstraction, I'm really interested in psychology and really interested in kind of other worlds and other realms that kind of exist beyond what we know and what we understand and what's tangible. And so in that way, I feel like exploring abstraction is a way to explore those realms and those worlds and hidden mysteries. And I think weaving definitely relates to that, in this idea of ritual and this idea of kind of meditation and meditating and thinking about all of those things that we can't fully know or explain. So it's kind of like a fusion of all of these ideas when I think about abstraction and the work that I'm creating through that lens.
So I mean, I feel like for me, abstraction has been answered a lot of questions for me over time, and gave me the ability to shield things, I think, or encode things in ways that specific folks might have access to information that maybe another viewer doesn't. So for me, I'm thinking about that abstraction has like this history that like is so enmeshed in painting, in American painting, like work made by white men at a certain point. Whereas I think like if I think about abstraction, I think about quilts, and I think about the ways that textiles more often than not are kind of line and color. So like they are like abstractions, geometric abstractions that like throughout time have done a lot of things, like tell you where someone might be from, or what part of the world this thing was made in, and what its function was just by how it looks. So to me, I got to this point where it's like, oh, I can say things with no language or image. So it was like this maybe naive idea that like, oh, I could save the world through abstraction. I can say everything that I need to say. And I think that was a response to making things that were legible at a certain point and having like terrible reads of work by folks that were like saying things that were not at all in work that I thought was legible. So I kind of retreated to abstraction as a kind of, okay, I'll like take 2 steps back to get folks to the message, or if they're going to, for instance, read kind of like racist, crazy things into work, I might as well like, I think that they would still do that whether or not abstract versus kind of figurative, for instance. So it's kind of like I want to play this game thing, I think, at first for me. But then the more I made abstraction, the more I think I understood how to like pull levers to get people to see certain things, which kind of led to returning to kind of doing both the kind of figurative and abstract works. Yeah, I wanted to say something else about abstraction, but I forgot it.
That's okay. You actually get on something really important that I wanted to talk about, which was legibility. There's so many things in that I want to talk about, like the bad reads of your work. What happens when people don't get your ideas? What happens when you hit up against the signifiers being limited? And do you care if they're limited? Do you care if only a certain population can read your work in the way you want it read? You know, does that matter to you?
I think on one hand, absolutely, it matters. And on the other hand, so with my work, I usually try to create it in a way that I'm hitting on like these very personal ideas or these things that are near and dear to me and maybe my experience in particular, or the experience of my community, right, or my environment. But my goal is to always kind of like broaden that and open that up to where it's a conversation that collectively and universally, like if I use like universal signifiers, and that's why I like so much using the cosmic as a point of reference. And everybody has a relationship to the moon, you know, or the sun, the stars, the whatever. And so I like to use these kind of universal signifiers so that everyone can take something or can bring something or can read something or has some sort of relationship to it, even if I'm exploring these very personal ideas. It's hopefully broadened up, like I try to broaden that gesture so that these are conversations that we can all kind of relate to in one way or another, even if they are very specific and personal. So yes, yes, but no. It's ideal, you know, when you have this kind of given set of concepts or ideas or this thing that you're discussing or tackling in the work for your audience to get that. Obviously that's great, you know, but also if they don't get that and it's something along the same lines, but then that person's personal experience, they're bringing something else to the table that maybe you hadn't thought of. I also love that. I love hearing those stories, especially when it's like a memory or history, and the work that I do so much about that as well, that I love hearing that, and then that gets me to thinking of some other relationship maybe I had with some memory or history that's along the same lines, or maybe not. But I love, you know, when all these intersections and all these ideas are woven together, and I think that's what kind of like reinforces or enhances the original idea that I kind of started out with.
Yeah, legibility I feel like is a thing that I wrestle with, and I would say like at the kind of root, I would lean more to like, it's okay if they don't get it, where I feel like you were leaning more towards like, yeah, I'd like them to get something, and I'm like, if they walk in and they think it's beautiful, that's maybe enough. But I think this idea of legibility makes me think maybe even about the idea of like to be legible, we'd have to all agree on like the same basic language, right? And I feel like I'm more into this idea that like people will see the image and they have that kind of sensation of like when you're sort of looking for a word, like oh, I know this thing or these basic ideas that this artist is trying to get across, but like I'm struggling for the language for in there somehow, is what feels like the space that I want to get at, where like someone is wrestling with the image, or like they can apply a certain set of memories or ideas, but maybe they're still sort of like caught up in this space of like trying to translate what they're seeing to what they're experiencing on some level. Like feels to me like a very successful place to be. Like I really love the moments when I'm in the gallery and someone's like, you know, telling me what the work is, and it is true, but I also love that moment where someone's like, I'm getting all these other things and I need to like sort of, you know, try to download that. For me also seems like that the work can be kind of like a portal in that way, that it can open up all these other sort of conversations and experiences.
I'm going to come back to the portal thing because that is actually a question that I have. But I wanted to say, one of the things that I have recognized about both of your work is that my historical understanding, my personal historical understanding of a woven work is a particular thing, that it happens to be coded Black, that happens to be coded rural. You know, all of these restrictions my life experience has put on my perception of what a woven work is. And then being able to see your contemporary work, be it abstract or figurative, it signals to me kind of that you're building upon a tradition in a way that I didn't even think to conceive of as possible. And so it's like you keep expanding the boundaries of this medium, which is one of the reasons that drew me so closely to your work. I see your work and I see movement and development and almost like a timelessness in the way that you conceive of chaos, because it is timeless. There's no linear, straight ahead kind of experience, and that's my experience in my life. And so, you know, I just wanted to say that. But before we get to the portal, I wanted to ask, both of you have referred to your work. Actually, I'll just conflate these questions. Both of you have referred to your work as a body, and both of you have referred to your work as portals or entry points. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know for me in my work, I talk a lot about landscape and these ideas of hybrid landscapes. And so when thinking about the landscape, I think specifically of bodies of land and bodies of water, and kind of the not only the great things about them, but also like the catastrophe and the destruction and the breakdown and the wear down. But then even pushing beyond that, like thinking of all of that in relationship to a body of a person, right? And thinking of the relationships there between a body of land or a body of water and a body of a person that have lived through things, that have experienced things, that are scarred from certain things, that have healed themselves and kind of pushed beyond tragedy or you know, this difficult experience. And I love this idea of healing and this idea of transformation and this idea of thinking about those ideas and those things kind of pushing beyond the chaos and coming out of that chaos. And so I think for me, I'm really, that's kind of what I'm exploring now. Sometimes when I'm weaving and I'm thinking of these bodies of land and bodies of people, I'm thinking of actually creating, like I've done some works where I'm creating that kind of shape of whatever that shape is. It's always abstracted, right? But does it reference then a very specific body of land and body of water, or is it just this kind of like feeling or this emotion? Or I'm really into these ideas of these thought forms where it's like just this body, it's this center of energy. And so I think a lot of that is like this body of energy as well. And so sometimes those are woven kind of flat, and it's about this shape that it's creating, or this place, and then that kind of then relates to that kind of like point of entry, or that portal, or that thing that you feel like you want to have this very intimate relationship with and enter through. Where does it end up on the other side? Who knows, you know? Somewhere, nowhere, anywhere. Places in your mind, places in your imagination, actual places. And so I'm really interested in all of those ideas. And I think that's kind of the relationship with my work to these ideas of bodies. Also, sometimes I'll do a lot of like sculpting of those bodies, so they won't be like these flat kind of shapes that are more about color and energy. They'll be more about like this occupation of space, and the space, still the energy as well, that this three-dimensional weaving is kind of occupying and exploring body in that way.
Man, I feel like this is one of those questions. I've thought about this so long that I'm like, I can't, it's hard to unravel. Like, but I think on one level, like weaving and like the act of weaving, the act of creation are so kind of like tied in all cultures, the act of sort of like birth. That's one reason I think maybe about the weavings as bodies. Like you spend so much time and put so much of your physical energy into them that it seems like once it's off the loom, it's like it's more than a thing. It's a body, and I think there's just something about for me trying to access these ideas around kind of mending and healing that also feel like I do things in the cloth to sort of indicate like something being mended or sutured together, that all of these sort of movements in creating the piece just like lend themselves back to how we treat like our bodies, our flesh, that even in the abstract works, I was always kind of thinking about how can I imply a body if there's a zipper or a hole or something hanging here, that start to make the works feel like they're addressing things related to this vessel. So I think that's what the kind of body thing is for me, but I think that also doubles as this kind of portal thing, because I'm imagining you, the viewer, standing in front of the work and feeling some sort of draw or pull or kind of connection, that this thing becomes, if not a portal, at least a mirror, that like by looking at this body on a wall, you start to think about your own.
So can you both talk about how you put your own body ideas, identity, how your fears and anxieties or your joys, how those materialize in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So sitting at the loom, like we've been talking about how it requires so much of you, what I found really interesting and also terrifying a little bit was it does require so much of your body, and you know, you do have to take care that you don't overexert yourself, which is easy to do when weaving for too long. But also what I really found really interesting, and like I said, equal parts terrifying, was how much of like my mind and kind of like my entire energy was like consumed at the loom. And what by that I mean, so I have like difficulty sometimes, you know, really focusing and really being present. And I found the way that you almost need to be very present and to really be in the moment at the loom. I found that to be a little bit daunting at first. But then I kind of came back around to it and was just like, you know, that's the beauty of creating in this way, is this process that requires me to focus and requires me to be still, because I do not, when I'm making anything else, like if I'm making work in clay, or if I'm dyeing, or if I'm sewing, or doing any other kind of techniques or processes, I'm moving. I'm around the studio, but having to sit and be still and I mean, you're still moving, you're still creating for sure, and like moving around and grabbing things and getting things from here and there. But the way that it requires me to be still and present mentally and emotionally, I feel like that is kind of something that was like difficult for me to at first reconcile with, you know, this piece of equipment that's requiring all of this and all of these ways. But that's something I've come to really love about weaving, and it's one of it's probably why that's like my favorite process in the studio is its ability to do that, to really command your full attention. I mean, now in that full attention, am I able to then think about other things and, you know, daydream or do a little bit of other thoughts as well? Yes, but that's what I love about it, is that everything is still, but everything is still, you know, moving around and very fluid and flexible as well. And yeah, that's what I love about it. Being able to be completely present and still and in the moment while making.
Yeah. I would say, like, on a kind of practical level, the fear component has so much to do with how much it demands of your body. Like, I get to these points where I'm like, oh, like my wrists are throbbing. Like I can't do any of these things today or maybe tomorrow. And I mean, I think I always, you know, use like snap back, but I think my recent anxiety is around this idea of like, what if I couldn't, like, what if I couldn't snap back? Like, what would I make? Would I still be able to weave? You know, like, so I have all these kind of existential questions about how I would be able to identify as a weaver on some level. And I would say some of the things that surface in the work around kind of these ideas of like things that I can't stop thinking about that permeate the work are these ideas about violence. And my own like fear of like witnessing or having violence like visited upon my body. Like, I think a lot of the kind of imagery, maybe those things kind of come forward, and but I also think that is historical. So I'm like looking at things about violence that happened yesterday or that happened 500 years ago. So I think I'm always trying to walk this fine line in the work of like, how do I show those things, or how do I like witness them and process them and depict them, but also like leave space to think about all these like other beautiful things that happen in life that are intimate and charged. And I've just recently kind of gotten to this space where I've been thinking about the kind of tension between intimacy and violence, and how sometimes they can be two different expressions of the same thing, unfortunately. Yeah. That would be the thought, maybe.
I'll tell you that question came from the initial conversation we had, where you introduced me to the symbol or the ideology of the Ouroboros, and that's kind of what clicked, like, I have things to say about this, because it pairs with the phrase, the loom eats, and I was thinking of the process of putting so much of your body into something. What is it eating, and how is it producing something? What is it producing? And that kind of pushed me to really want to do a show of your work, because this cyclical process, you know, when you think of a loom, you think of the result. You're not necessarily thinking of what is going into it to produce this piece of cloth or this piece of art. And so I want you to talk about material, but I also want you to talk about themes like the Ouroboros that you are playing upon, or return to, revisit, that we see permeate through your work.
Absolutely. So I think it was interesting how you kind of like the connections there coming out of that question, talking about the Ouroboros, and just really quickly, you were talking about like the energy put into the loom, and then the energy or the things that come out. And so I guess simply put, like what I was talking about earlier, where like all of these anxieties or all of this like inability to focus or challenges to focus, like go in, I feel like, and then, you know, what comes out is like, you know, this this cloth or this thing or this unknown or like this stillness also, and this kind of meditative calming, as well as this cloth and this thing. But yeah, so the Ouroboros, I think the reason that we were kind of in conversation about that is like I was doing all of these ideas and explorations on like cyclicality and the idea of the eternal return. And there's all of this kind of like that I'm thinking about like in the transformation and kind of like thinking about metamorphosis, and it's like thinking of that and through the lens of chaos, and like thinking about chaos but then like taking it a step further, kind of like what comes out of that or what's next, I guess, and trying to answer those questions and through this symbol. And I'm really interested in all of the different symbols and metaphors and all of the mythology from all different types of communities and cultures, and the reasons that these symbols become popular. Are they, good or bad? Are they ambiguous? Thinking about the serpent, and I've really been kind of interested in this idea of the serpent lately, or the snake, and everything from like, there's these biblical connotations, and these stories and these myths there, but then it's like very bad and ominous and whatever. But then there's also like this powerful, like there's the deities and priestesses who use the serpent as their symbol of power and their representations of themselves, and snakes are worshipped or snakes are eaten or this, so I'm really interested in everything from the high, the low, the in between, the good, the bad, and how people bring, kind of like what we were talking about earlier, where people arrive with their own kind of like ideas about this certain thing or this thing that they're experiencing that's hanging on the wall in the gallery or your work or whatever. And so I like those kind of like symbols of myth and culture because of that, because people kind of bring their own, and especially animals. And so I'm really interested in animal symbolism, and there's human-animal relationships and how that relates to the landscape, and how bodies of animals and bodies of human and bodies of land and water, and how all of those things are interconnected, and how all of those things kind of impact each other. Thinking about the cosmic and how it kind of then impacts all of those things. And so thinking about connectivity and thinking about ties and thinking about energy fields and how all of these things are tied together in one way or another, that's kind of what I'm exploring in the work. And that's what I'm exploring through weaving and the other textile processes, for sure.
Did you have anything you wanted to?
I thought that was perfect. I'm agreeing with this question. Yeah.
So before we get to talking about materials, because I still want to go there, do you ever think about the spaces your works create? Like once you put your work in a space, how that affects the space? Or is it more that your work is a space?
I think in the moment of creation, for sure, but I don't think it's a space, maybe again, as much until, not necessarily the architecture as much as like the people who then come and fill it, or the works that it's in conversation with.
Yeah, I agree. I also agree, though, about the point that you made about maybe the works themselves are the space. For sure. The ability they have to be a space and be a vessel that contains space and all of that, yes.
Okay, so back to materials. Can you please tell me a little bit about how you utilize materials and non-traditional materials for weaving?
Absolutely. So with the materials, for me, the process that I kind of have arrived to in my practice is really just being a collector. I have always been an avid collector, and I continue on just collecting things. It could be the smallest things to the largest things, to things that have meaning, things that people have given to me that have meaning, that they give me stories about, and I'm just like, whoa, you know? And seeing those materials then find themselves and find their way into the work. I really like to mix it all together. I really like to push the boundaries between what is a high material or something that's like refined and beautiful and elegant with something that I literally just saw on the side of the highway and I stopped my car and hopped out and got it. That's trash that millions of people are like driving past every day and not paying an ounce of attention to. So I really like thinking about objects and thinking about our relationships to them and thinking about why some objects have more meaning and more importance and we hold near and dear to us, and other ones we discard and throw out of our windows as we're, you know, or throw in the trash or find their way into the landfill. And I really like pushing those boundaries. I also like thinking about kind of the stories these things tell and kind of like the power they have to tell those stories. And so one time I was asked a question about, you know, well, why do you use sometimes things that are old or things that are used or discarded? I feel like that's problematic because they bring too much history or they bring too much of something that you don't really want in your work. And so I thought about it for a while and I was like, well, sure, that's true. But I was like, it could also be true, though, that is the very reason that I am embracing that in the work and bringing those things in, because they have that. Like, even if you are, say, for example, going to make a sculpture out of 1 million plastic straws, like, you can't, even that, like, even though that material is brand new, even though that material is raw, like, it still is bringing its own, you know, meanings and, you know, interpretations that we're going to have as viewers when we interact with that sculpture, if we're recognizing those as straws at some point or another, and plastic at some point or another. So I really am kind of embracing that in the work and constantly trying to think about, I really love juxtaposition. So if I have like a lot of a matte material, I really am like looking for something shiny to like mix it up and shake it up. If I have like a really dark, lots of dark materials, I love to have like a pop of something light. So I really love those intersections when things that just do not belong together, bringing them right on together and in the same space and in the same work. I feel like that's, you know, echoing life and that echoes so many things of, and that's kind of like what I like to play up in the work is the juxtapositions there with material and color and texture, just pushing those boundaries and high and low.
I feel like materially for me it's over time gotten a little tighter, but I would say like I've been asking myself a lot of questions about what material is. So for instance, like if I dye the threads before I weave them, I think it would be easy to make the case that the dye is a material, but I've been interested in this idea that like, oh, the water is also a material, and especially like where does that water come from? Like if it's from the tap or from a river, from rain, like what does that impart to the work that it wouldn't otherwise have? And what does it mean to claim this thing that maybe becomes invisible or easily sort of written off as not important to the work? But I've also been curious about like if I dye these things with tea or if I dye them with wine or if I take color out with bleach, like what do those things mean on a kind of conceptual level? How can I extend that to ideas around vocabulary? Or to go back again to this idea of legibility. Like I think saying the word tea to someone who's from the South, who might be Black, who might be queer, like they will start to take on other kind of connotations, I think. And then cotton is also this thing that invades my work, I would say, that the majority, I'd say 80% of everything is cotton. which is important to me to use thinking about kind of the kind of histories that we are living in and after. That to make beautiful things out of something that has kind of a violent, charged, any kind of negative association you could make, but to make it intentionally and by choice, like all of those things feel important. Like they kind of they don't reduce the history, but they leave space to think about like kind of these possible futures again.
Well, you know, as a curator who is not an art historian, I study material and material culture. And so both of your works are kind of like a gold mine of interrogation to material and meaning making. In the process of looking at like your assemblage works, or even a woven work that you can tell or piece together from different materials, you can look at it and you can say like, this material means this material means this. But what's most interesting is starting to, kind of like you said, that conversation. What does it mean when you put this material next to this material? What does it mean when this material is dyed this particular color or damaged even? And so it becomes a process of meaning making versus playing off of the meaning of a material that's already exists. And so do you ever intentionally make meaning, or have you found yourself transforming the meaning of a material you make or you use in your work often?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm trying to like pinpoint a really great like example of that. That's not quite coming to my head at the moment, but yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I'm constantly striving to do in the work, is to create my own meaning with something that might already have its own meanings associated with it. But yeah, to embrace that and to explore that, absolutely, from everything from you know, the random like cassette tapes that I use, or the tires that I use, to the warp itself, all of those things. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say for me, certainly in the beginning it was about kind of these juxtapositions of materials, but I think it's sort of, as the materials themselves have become more fixed and the meanings sort of resonate across the works, it's become about the ways that the images or the processes or patterns collide, where the kind of meanings feel less stable. But I think for me, the materiality has come to a place where it all sort of like hums along without me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so there's kind of an interiority with both of your work. How important is it to you to be relevant to contemporary concerns? Are you ever thinking about what's going on in the world? And I know this is funny because we're talking about chaos, right? And how can you not? But are you thinking of direct correlations between things like police violence, or turtles with straws in their nose, or, you know, these contemporary questions that may not seem as evident in interior work?
Yes. 100%.
And that's important to you?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's not always like, you know, this interface kind of representation of all that thing like you were talking about, with the work being very kind of interior, but I do, that it would be very difficult not to consider all of those things and not to think of all of those things, and not to, even if it's not, you know, an in-your-face kind of representation, or in-your-face kind of like dialogue about those things, they're definitely, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that for me it's like one of the things I kind of take into the studio when I'm creating new images or new works, especially when they're figurative, is this idea, like one of the kind of rules is like I don't allow things to enter the work that would situate it in time. So for instance, I would probably never weave a car because to me that means that I'm situating this somewhere in like a particular, at least century, and to me it like flattens. It then would flatten the work in a way that for me it's about getting people to sort of think about 6 things at once, not like that one thing. So if I make an image with a dog and a person, I am hoping that maybe someone would think about kind of police dogs, or like dogs hunting people or animals, or like their relationship with their pet. So to me it's like I don't want to have the images so static that you're like, got it. Like I like that kind of complication of thinking about kind of myth and folklore, but also thinking about contemporary events and like a historical thing, all sort of pulsing. And like, although the works are woven, like I think so much in that way about collage. Like to me, it's about this idea of like, if I present you with this kind of field of images, then you're allowed to kind of put them together mentally, however you choose, to get back to this kind of core of signs and symbols.
Do you think there's something revolutionary about that? Of not being so graphic or direct?
Uh-huh.
Well, I do. I definitely do. I think that there's something extremely powerful, and even to reference the work behind you, there's something extremely powerful in representing the body, particularly the Black body, existing despite all, existing with resistance, existing and feeling both joys and pains, because it's humanizing. And I think that's very important work. So can you talk about how the process of naming your works play into meaning making and the significance of it for you? Both of you have very intricate titles for your works.
Yeah, I would say with naming of my work, it does require quite a bit of time, a lot more time than I'd like to admit. But yeah, I spend a decent amount of time thinking about considering everything from like kind of ecological readings I've done, thinking about like current events, and sometimes I'll reference something just ever so slightly in the title. Sometimes not, most of the time not. But referencing all the different types of research that kind of come together. Music is huge, and kind of like, thinking of lyrics. Maybe those are lyrics that I've kind of like made up in my mind. I think a lot about words and think a lot about meaning. I'm a sucker for like all those words that like, sometimes I see them online and they're like the words that don't exist in the English dictionary, and those words I'm so drawn to because they mean so much, and they kind of come together and coalesce and make this beautiful thing that is like intangible to one, language, but is like this whole other thing in another language. And I love that. And so with my titles, I'm kind of like thinking in that same way, like thinking of a poem or thinking of this way that I can bring together words and bring together different little glimpses from different parts of my research or different parts of my studies or my affinities at the time for whatever it is that I'm investigating, and kind of like bringing those together to make this thing. Also listening to the work, I think, is key. A lot of times I'll start with one idea of a title and I'll end up with something completely different just from responding to the work and what it's kind of wanting to be and to exist as and to be called. And I just think titles, names of people, names of things are very important. And so I invest a lot of time there naming the works. I think it's just as important to really bring things full circle.
Yeah, it's so interesting, like hearing you talk about it, because I'm like, yeah, like that's how I think. But it's in my mind and in the studio, it feels so concrete. But then when I hear you say it and I think about it, I'm like, wow, this sounds so nebulous, right? Like there's something about it, but to me it's like so much about, like it's not as like, it doesn't have the same specificity maybe as science. Like it maybe is more about this idea that you were bringing up that I was like really excited about earlier around conjuring. Like to me, it's like everything's in this pot and I just wait for it to kind of like surface. And so I feel like I'm always like, when I get to titling, it's like, okay, I have to take in like 80,000 things. And then I'm like, oh, the word snow keeps coming up. And so then I'm like laying on my floor, looking on my phone at like synonyms for snow. And then I'm like, well, like what, you know, so then you're like down this rabbit hole over here, like, and then I'm like, oh, but that relates to the thing I saw yesterday that my mom was talking about, you know, so then I'm like, okay, I gotta string all these, I'm always like stringing together meaning somehow. So I feel like the title has to be that thing that like offers something to the viewer where it's like, I've seen the piece, I look at that title, I look at the piece again, and somehow I can start to bring together kind of like that specificity that maybe I have like baked into the work, that maybe then will like open a door for the viewer if for whatever reason they haven't already kind of like gone through that portal that we were talking about earlier, by just like simply looking at the piece. Like I hope it's just like another bit of information, that it's another kind of aesthetic decision that pops forward in the work. Yeah.
And so this exhibition, Looming Chaos, sounds kind of dark. Like it sounds heavy, and you know, we talk about chaos and destruction and the deterioration of the environment. But what I want to tease out of it is, in utilizing the symbol of the Ouroboros, is that there is a point of creation, of recycling, of rebirth, of healing, of suturing. There's this point where things do again reconnect and become whole and become something new, you know. And so I wanted to ask, and we've talked about temporality throughout this conversation, but how is your work conceiving of a future, conceiving of what's next, conceiving of what we can't see right now?
That's a great question. I think that's exactly what I'm wanting the work to do. I'm wanting to go back and reach and grasp all of those incredible, you know, historical traditions of making do with nothing, or making through these kind of textile ways of creating and bringing together, and you know, rich histories of handcraft, and going back to the past to kind of like get all of that into like what's been passed on to me, and maybe what has not, and going back to get that. And in the present, I'm, you know, making sense of, you know, who I am and what I'm doing here and why I do what I do, and you know, putting all that in the bag. And as far as the future, the only thing, you know, I don't know. I don't know, maybe the work doesn't completely know, but all you can do is bring those things and put them together, combine them in ways that you can only hope will kind of look past and look towards something that is better and is more hopeful, is more unified, is more all of those things. I don't know. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me it's like the idea that I was talking about, at the Loom, it feels like time travel. Like in the work that I make, it's so much like pulling from all these different kind of sources, and like trying to keep it in this space that it doesn't, you know, as much as I don't want it to feel like it is always about like the present moment or the past, like I would hope that like somehow these images can be applied to kind of the future, and that like I don't know what they'll do, but I hope that they are a time capsule. Like in 50 years, people will look at them and they still sort of resonate, or maybe they will be situated in time, and that like that animal doesn't exist, or like, oh, like that kind of violence doesn't exist, or you know, all these sorts of things, or maybe it does, and that's also like, I think that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in the work too, so in a lot of the work that I do, I'm investigating alchemy a lot as well. And so for me, just by investigating alchemy as a concept, it is like investigating ideas of, you know, transformation and metamorphosis and hope, right? And so in that way, I'm hoping, you know, that we're, you know, I'm looking to the future, and so it might not be this like concrete, yes, the future here, now, here's how it is, but for sure, like through these concepts, through this way of working and piecing together all of these things and looking to something better beyond, hopefully. Right?
Sure.
Well, the exhibition opens in January of 2020. And right now you're commissioned to make 5 pieces for the exhibition. Can you talk about your process in making those and what we can expect to see from you? Or
Absolutely. So I am definitely looking forward to creating some larger scale woven works, lots of collage and assemblage and bringing in the found objects, but really just, you know, ramping up the scale and ramping up kind of like color and context by which kind of like these pieces are going to be displayed on. And other than that, I'm really open to seeing what happens in the studio and seeing how things evolve, because you can start out with a dedicated kind of plan and things inevitably take shape and take form, and I'm open to all of that, so it'll be interesting to see how everything comes together.
well, we are so excited to have you. And so y'all are welcome to enjoy the gallery. Thank you again.
Thank you.